Sports thrive on parity. No one wants to watch the same team, or even the same couple teams, take turns passing championship trophies around. It's the hope that next season, anything can happen. But parity is not naturally occurring. If you don't change anything after every season, then the same teams stay at the top and the same stay at the bottom. Because of this, the commonly accepted formula in sports is to reward the worst team in the league with the highest draft pick the very next year. The worse you do, the better choice you get of the talent coming into the league. Sounds fair enough. It creates a nice cycle. However, while designed to ensure parity in a sport, this system, at its core, incentivizes losing. When you actively reward a team for not winning games with no limit on those rewards, one piece of the cycle becomes abused for multiple years on end in hopes of maximizing the next two stages. If every action really does have an opposite reaction, the logic tracks. This is a strategy that, in just the last couple decades, has become widely known as tanking. The year 1976. The sport? Basketball. The team rocketing to the bottom, a hues tone of red. A guy named Moses couldn't possibly see this far ahead, but the words he just said will set in motion a decades-long thread that's taken franchises and fan bases, coaches and careers to their deathbed. Moses Malone didn't say much to start this domino effect. The all-powerful words were simply a trade request. You see, Moses played in the ABA, a competitor in the pro basketball scene. The NBA merged with the ABA in 1976, bringing 4 brand new teams to the league. The Spirits of St. Louis, Moses' team, were not one of them. A few of the ABA teams had folded, these 4 were let into the league, but that left the rosters of the Spirits and the Kentucky Colonels completely up for grabs. The NBA took Big Moses and thrust him into the junk drawer draft of leftover players from these 2 teams, and he went 5th overall to the Trailblazers. This dispersal draft, with only talent from 2 ABA squads, neither of which finished in the top 3 of the ABA last year, had just 12 total players selected. 3 of them are in the Hall of Fame, 4 would be All-Stars. The ABA was not lacking in talent. For Moses, though, the roller coaster wasn't nearly over. The Trailblazers had chosen him as nothing more than trade bait. They had 2 picks in this draft, and they liked their earlier one, power forward Maurice Lucas, a lot more. With the big redhead, Bill Walton, already holding down a spot in their front court, there was just no place for Moses Malone. He was quickly traded to the Buffalo Braves. That's where he would begin the 1976 season. He wouldn't last long. After the first 2 games, Moses had played a grand total of 6 minutes. He demanded more playing time, and the front office refused. So he demanded that trade. In due time, Moses parted ways with this squad and joined the sea of red that is the Houston Rockets. Nope, sorry, not even close. There we go. It didn't take the Moses-led Rockets too long to get going. He was an all-star in his 2nd season, league MVP in his 3rd. They got into the playoffs, even won a couple rounds. 81 seemed like a down year. The Rockets finished below 500, but they were able to sneak into the postseason again. And once you're in, anything can happen. As the 6th seed, the Rockets got matched up against the defending champion Los Angeles Lakers. In no uncertain terms, this is a basketball team of the gods. The Lakers would spend the 1980s making 8 separate finals appearances. You know 2 players from this team. Magic Johnson is young, fresh off scoring 42 points in Game 6 last year to clinch the NBA title while playing the center position because he's Magic Johnson and you're not. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar would make first-team All-NBA and All-Defense while averaging a calm 26 per game on 57% shooting. That's a fun combo. You know what else is fun? They had 3 more players who received MVP votes. This is, by all measurable accounts, one of the greatest sports teams of all time that has already embarked on one of the greatest dynasties in athletics history. And in the middle of it, the scrappy 6 seed, led by Moses goddamn Malone, bounced them out of the first round of the playoffs. He scored 38 points and 23 rebounds in Game 1. This is David laughing pitifully at Goliath. The Rockets took down the 2-seed Spurs in 7 games next round. Moses did what he likes to do. Yes, that does say 41 and 15. Tiny but mighty Calvin Murphy deserves a shout too. Not only did he blast off scoring-wise, the man did not start any of the first 6 games. This is off the bench, and he did it all while standing at 5'9" tall. In Game 7, the Rockets finally decided to let the hot hand start. He did not diss up, dropping 42 points. Alright, you know what? I'm sorry. Opportunities like this do not come up very often. We need to talk more about Calvin Murphy. This is a perplexing basketball player and human being. Don't think of Calvin through this section as some larger-than-life athletic superstar. Think of him as a guy who grew up in Connecticut. A newspaper article written about him when he was younger had this sentiment, saying he couldn't be described as easily as most hoopers. The thing is, Calvin Murphy is the most common answer when discussing the worst players in the Hall of Fame. He snuck in there with a single All-Star appearance and really no other career accolades to show. I think that fact plays into why you can't judge a player based purely on awards, because that one All-Star appearance does nothing to show what he did in, say, this series, and it deserves recognition. Calvin might also have, and I mean this sincerely, the coolest in-game picture ever taken of a basketball player. How many guys can you name that wore a hockey helmet while playing in NBA games because they had a concussion? But the actual reason Murphy is immortalized in Springfield is the name of the honor itself. This is not the NBA Hall of Fame, it's the Basketball Hall of Fame, and Calvin Murphy also happens to be a college hoops legend. At Niagara University, he torched any and everyone. He would average 38 points a game one year, including when he set a Division I record at the time with 68 against Syracuse. And the weirder part is, by his senior year, he had dropped over 8 points a game while in college. I'm telling you, he's just an odd guy. Murphy also probably didn't realize it, but he was inspiring athletes like Phillip Rivers and Tyreek Hill with his actions. That is to say, he has 14 children with 9 different women. And what's awesome is that none of this is why I wanted to talk more about Calvin Murphy. This is. Yeah, that's a Hall of Famer deep into competition in the National Baton Twirling Championships. Now, he actually won nationals as an 8th grader, showed a lot of potential and promise. That was after being bullied into the sport by his mother and sisters, his words, not mine, but after a break of over a decade, at the height of his NBA career, he came back and won the Texas State Championship. That right there is an interesting man. Okay, back to tanking. I guess we haven't really talked about tanking yet. Let's just keep talking about Moses Malone. I'm sure we'll get there. Right, we're in the middle of the playoffs. The Rockets survived past the Spurs in 7. I'd love to point out that this Spurs team, led by the Iceman George Gervin, maybe had the worst player to receive an MVP vote in George Johnson, who averaged 5 points a game, 7 rebounds, and an impressive 3.4 blocks on less than 50% shooting. Someone voted him to be MVP. Anyways, the Rockets booked themselves a date with the Kansas City Kings. I know what you're saying right now. Hayden, the Kansas City Kings? Weren't they colloquially referred to as the Kansas City Omaha Kings, playing a number of home games in Omaha each season to expand fan presence? Well, informed viewer, if you really did exist, that would be a great question. But the Kings' presence in Omaha was only for 3 seasons. After that, a full-size stadium was built for them in Kansas City, and they became full-time residents in the Paris of the Plains. But even the Eiffel Tower could not have stopped Moses Malone. 42-23, then 36-11 to send you back to Missouri. The Houston Rockets, the lowly 6-seed loser record having, were on to the NBA Finals. This is maybe the greatest Cinderella run and one of the most amazing individual performances in NBA playoff history. They were the 3rd team to ever reach the point with a below 500 record, and no one has done it since. Unfortunately, they blasted off into a force far stronger and luckier than them, one that could shut down Moses on the offensive end and purely overwhelm him on defense. The Boston Celtics won the 81 Finals in 6 games. Still, the future in Houston seemingly called for a nice pair of sunglasses. 1982 was a slight down year. The team finished with a far better regular season record, but they were bounced in the first round by a supersonic team led by the horribly underrated duo of Gus Williams and Jack Sikma. But these 82 games were highlighted by Moses Malone taking home his 2nd NBA MVP award, putting up 31 and 15 a night. At this point, the team is close. You have your star, you have playoff experience, you're not far away from a ring. So, it's time for everyone's favorite game. Your Dad Owner! Alrighty, what decision do you make to put this team over the edge? Trade, signing, who do you draft? Well, I'm sorry about this, Mr. Owner, but someone has offered you $11 million for your basketball team, so you sold them. You're gonna have to leave the building. So, new management comes on in. They didn't really feel that the reigning MVP was worth his league-leading salary of over $1 million a year. But with his contract coming to an end, Moses was looking to negotiate with new management for some more money. New management decided to take a page out of an amazing book, Fundamentals of Business by Nico Harrison, and traded away Moses Malone. Not only was the 2-time MVP in his prime dealt for a single first-round pick in 32-year-old Caldwell Jones, but they sent him to the Philadelphia 76ers. The Sixers were fresh off a finals appearance where they lost to that Dynasty Lakers team in 6 games. They had Dr. J, Maurice Cheeks, Bobby Jones, then they added the NBA MVP Moses Malone. This is only comparable to the Warriors adding Kevin Durant in 2016, and the fact that a worthy comparison exists is bonkers. You don't need to think too hard to know how the next NBA season ended. Philly won 65 games. The playoffs were easier than that. In a finals rematch, this time including a guy named Moses, the 76ers walked through the Lakers, sweeping them behind finals MVP winning. He led the team in rebounding every single game of the playoffs, and he led the team in scoring every game of the finals. The Sixers' single loss through the whole postseason is a record that still stands today, only tied and technically beaten by the 2001 Lakers and 2017, Kevin Durant added, Warriors, who each also lost 1 game but had more to play. But okay now, what about those Rockets? How'd things work out? The second worst record in NBA history, 14 wins and 68 losses. Not a single player on the team averaged more than 15 points, or 9 rebounds, or 7 assists per game. They had 8 separate 5-game losing streaks in an 82-game season. That means for more than half the games they played this year, they were actively within a 5-game losing streak. And if you can believe it, we're still not talking about tanking yet. This is a phenomenon often confused with tanking, known as a team just being horrible. Now, the Rockets earned the first pick in the NBA draft this year. This was before the draft lottery existed at all. The worst two teams in each conference would simply flip the coveted and all-important coin, regardless of who had a worse record, and the winner would get the first pick. The Rockets luckily won this coin flip. It's a bare-bones lottery system that only slightly discourages tanking, if at all, and it also has one more large flaw that you can try to figure out on your own, but we will touch on again. For the Rockets, though, heading into the 1983 NBA draft was a great time. Not only did they have that first pick, but they also had the third overall, courtesy of the Moses Malone trade. That netted them the obvious top prospect of the draft in Ralph Sampson, as well as Rodney McRae, a small forward who was literally described as someone who could be good at getting the ball to Ralph Sampson. So now you have two young players with loads of potential and a complete mess of a roster around them. Hold on a second, this is starting to sound like a video about tanking. Now, the Rockets weren't instantly thinking, let's suck it up and go get the first pick in '84. They came out as a below-average team in the season. There was some real effort with a 5-game win streak, and midway through, they sat at 20-26. But after a seemingly conscious decision to start giving heavy minutes to bench players, they would finish the season at 29-53. This 1984 Houston Rocket team is generally the first cited example of the true strategic maneuver of tanking. Now, it wasn't really hot goss at the time, but over the last few decades, basketball historians have looked back on this season and found it obvious that the team flipped a switch in a purposefully negative sense. But here's the thing, they weren't the worst team in the NBA. They weren't the second worst either. They took advantage of the league by losing 9 of their last 10 games, 14 of their last 17, and completely plummeting to the last spot in the Western Conference. 3 different teams in the East had a worse record than Houston. It did not matter. For the second year in a row, they got lucky on a 50-50 coin flip, once again over the Pacers, and were gifted the first pick in the NBA draft. There's the issue with that lottery system. Now, I've just left out one key factor of this tank job. This specific team had the added benefit of tanking into the 1984 draft class.
Hakeem Olajuwon, Sam Bowie, Michael Jordan, Charles.
So Houston walked their way right into Hakeem Olajuwon. It's a funny pick because it's impossible to call it anything besides one of the greatest draft picks ever, but you just can't shield your mind of the fact that it could have been even a bit better. Of course, we know how it went. Hakeem would lead the Rockets to back-to-back NBA championships, become maybe the greatest defensive player in NBA history, and most would agree, made a couple bad years in '83 and '84 well worth their while. Revisiting one random game, the Clippers' meaningless win against the Jazz in the final game of the season, is extremely interesting in the context of tanking. The Clippers didn't hold their first-round pick. They had it traded years ago to the 76ers, so they were essentially playing for Philly. If they lost, the Sixers got a 50-50 shot at the first pick and bump Houston out. So the Clippers still chose to go out and try to win this game. It's hard to imagine they'd make that same choice if they held their own selection. With them winning and the Rockets losing, Houston was able to coin flip into Olajuwon. It's a very zoomed in and specific account, but it's usually these types of meaningless end of season games where the benefits of tanking are at their absolute peak. This game very likely changed NBA history more than many regular. This game very likely changed NBA history more than almost any random regular season game ever has. Any sort of shuffling between these top 5 teams starts a butterfly effect that turns out completely different than the league we know today. This also serves as a pretty good example for why tanking is such a hard problem to solve. From, say, the standpoint of a general manager, does it not seem like losing that one little game is a risk worth taking for the potential upside of getting to draft a Hakeem Olajuwon? Well, the Rockets certainly thought so. And in hindsight, using that logic, even if you're full-blown anti-tanking, it really does seem like they made the best choice for the long-term success of their franchise, even if that choice was actively losing a game in the short term. The very next year, in 1985, the NBA would implement its draft lottery, a direct response to the Houston Rockets and an attempt to limit the behavior of purposely losing for a better draft pick. Now, the '84 Rockets were retroactively chosen as the first tanking team, really just because someone had to be labeled first. It's not accurate. I think people look back and started using them in large part because of the lottery spawning in reaction to them. There's also the position they were in heading into the season, a seemingly perfect time for a franchise to shut down and tank. And obviously, they ended up getting the results to back it up. But again, they weren't really the first. When speaking just about the idea of losing to try and better your team, it's a strategy that's been in play way before this. A famous example, far earlier than Houston's, is the Philadelphia Eagles Santa Claus incident. 'Twas the 1968 season, and all through the league, every team had a win, except for Philly. But with a hop and a punch, they skipped out for lunch. Okay, I can't do this. Teams played a total of 14 games. The Philadelphia Eagles sat at 0-11. They were in dead last in the NFL, trailed by the Buffalo Bills, who had one win and one tie. This season's biggest loser was going to have the lucky pick of the consensus first overall guy, a can't-miss prospect who could fit perfectly into any franchise like a glove. That was USC star running back O.J. Simpson. The Eagles controlled their own fate on drinking the juice. If they lost their final 3 games, they were gonna get a stab at OJ. And in the NFL, there's no lottery. The worst team gets the first pick, period. However, to the dismay of fans, the team won their next 2 games, losing the first overall draft position to Buffalo. The Bills would lose their final one, ensuring that they would receive the first pick. A killer deal for them that Eagles fans were not psyched about. In Philly's meaningless final matchup taking place in mid-December, they had a scheduled Christmas parade. Due to horrible weather, much of their extravagant presentation was unable to travel to the game. The team scrambled to find a random fan, a 20-year-old who happened to have worn a Santa suit to the game. They threw him out among some cheerleaders dressed as elves and had him walk out at the half. A stadium of dejected fans, pissed off and somewhat offended by the shoddy excuse for a Santa in front of them, were done. In possibly the most on-brand Philadelphia sports moment ever, they began pelting Santa Claus with snowballs, beer bottles, and hoagies. Tragically, there exists no footage of this beautiful scene. This isn't really cited as a tanking example, and properly so. Philly kept a competitive spirit and kept trying to win, but it does show that teams, and especially fans, were at least aware to the possible benefits of losing long ago. And this Eagles game wasn't the first ever occurrence either. Pinning down what team was really the earliest, first, original creator of tanking isn't practically possible, but the idea, even if it wasn't referred to as a heavily armored combat vehicle, has been around. Now, why do teams tank? Generally, it's a combination of factors like being a small market, having a particularly down year in terms of talent, or a certain special prospect being available in that year's draft. The sport that's had the most public issues with tanking is professional basketball. The NBA, among the three sports we're talking about today, not only has the worst tanking problem, but also has done the most to try and stop it, to honestly no success. This is mainly for two distinct reasons. For one, the NBA is simply the best sport at drafting. Identifying talent in basketball is statistically the easiest sport to do it in, and while busts definitely exist, they're able to accurately predict who's going to be great at a much higher percentage than the NFL or MLB. The second reason is that one player in the sport of basketball can make a much larger impact than any other sport. You can have a single draft pick, like LeBron James, who can go to 3 different teams and get all of them to the NBA Finals, doing it for 8 years in a row. In baseball, on the other hand, you can have the two greatest players of their generation on the same team and fail to win a single playoff game. Football falls somewhere in the middle of these two. We know one pick, especially a quarterback, can help turn a whole team around instantly to a degree much higher than baseball but lower than basketball. These two facts create a perfect storm that NBA teams have long ago realized can be abused for your own good. Of course, the NBA is not stupid. Well, I'll take that back. The NBA knows this. That's why after the Houston Rockets fiasco, they created something for the sole and utter purpose of stopping tanking: the draft lottery. 40 years later, the one issue that it was invented to fix has only gotten worse and become mainstream. You cannot really fail at a task worse than the draft lottery has failed at its own existence. And comically, for all 40 of those years, the NBA's refused to acknowledge their failure, instead trying to tweak the rules and specifics of the lottery every few years so they can pretend it works. But ever since the first one, in 1985, it's been pretty clear that the draft lottery causes more problems than solutions. You may have heard the story. The first try was the most infamous. Coming out of Georgetown, the NCAA champion Patrick Ewing was considered a generational prospect, and would still live near the top of any list of the most hyped up picks ever. But the NBA's original lottery system seemingly did a pretty solid job of discouraging tanking. It was simply every team that missed the playoffs had an equal chance at the first pick. That was achieved by 7 teams just having their logo placed into an envelope. They would be spun around, mixed in a bingo lottery sort of machine, and one would be drawn out to determine who got the first pick. Pretty simple. Bad teams tanking to the very bottom seed was completely useless in this formula, which is good. The NBA even decided to make a spectacle of it all, getting it on live TV to build drama and anticipation for who gets Ewing. It went absolutely perfect, with no controversy whatsoever. The Knicks lucked into the first pick, and everyone accepted it without question. Yeah, so a lot of people think the envelope was frozen. I guess the NBA put it in a freezer, and when the commissioner reached in to grab one, he felt the cold paper, flipped the others, and intentionally pulled out the Knicks. There's a whole nother group that thinks that when the commissioner threw the Knicks envelope into the spinny ball thingy, he knew which one it was and intentionally banged it against the side of the glass to bend its corner and know which one to grab. The Knicks winning the lottery obviously is the best thing for the NBA, a big market team getting a surefire star. Basketball more popular, NBA more money, good thing. But having a motive doesn't instantly make you guilty. It's a theory, and we'll leave it there. But not focusing on conspiracy, from a pure tanking standpoint, this wasn't a terrible start. The team with the worst record, the Warriors, only fell down 1 spot to the 2nd overall pick. The Pacers, who had the NBA's 2nd worst record, saw the negative potential as they plummeted to 7, the worst pick available. The NBA kept pushing along, but eventually they would come to realize that despite bad teams having no more reason to tank, there was a new glaring issue. In finding a solution to one problem, they created a whole new one. Teams on the bubble of the playoffs, who didn't think their roster was good enough to make a run, were now just tanking to get into the lottery. You could be the last team out and have just as good a shot at the first pick as anyone. If this system were still in use, this year's Phoenix Suns would have just as good odds to land Cooper Flag as the Utah Jazz. And for that reason, 5 years later in 1990, the league changed the lottery system from even to weighted odds. The worst team would have the highest odds at the number one pick, and it slowly decreased with everyone following. They still use the weighted system in the NBA today, though they've tweaked the odds multiple times through the last 35 years, and I won't bore you with every one of the slight statistical adjustments made. What is funny is how unnecessarily difficult it's become. Like the 85 version was simple, just 7 envelopes and a spinner, pull one out. In 1990, the first weighted year, it got a little more intense. There was 66 total ping pong balls, you just pulled them out. Still pretty straightforward. Flash to today. 14 balls, all numbered 1 through 14. They draw 4 at a time. There's 1,000 possible outcomes, each assigned to a different team with different amounts to each team and stuff. It is the most overly complicated thing ever. This is the result of a bunch of stubborn MBAs getting into a room and fighting about odds, eventually compromising on a half percentage point, unaware that they just cut 99% of the population out of having any interest or understanding in what is going on. Now, it was right at that 1990 point when the weighted system was introduced that the NBA stopped televising the live drawing of the picks and shifted to an announcement special after the drawing had already occurred behind closed doors. This is still how it happens. That's led many people to believe the NBA started doing it in secrecy so they could more easily rig it and not be caught like in 85. In truth, the lottery isn't shown live anymore because it does not make the most entertaining TV to watch a guy pull out random numbered ping pong balls, then a couple accountants flip through pages over and over. Still, a number of suspect winners of the draw have drawn plenty of suspicion from basketball fans. Now, let's get back to our timeline, which chronologically takes us to the NFL. Here, there's an interesting difference in the way teams go about trying to will themselves from the bottom to the top of the league. The Cowboys in the late 80s were aching, man, like the city of Troy after the horse thing. They were dominant in the 70s, they'd be dominant in the 90s, but there was a real lull period in between. The 1988 season began a stretch that belongs in this video, but can be looked at in different ways. The team was not good. They had no quarterback and threw out 3 different guys under center through the season. If you're a Browns fan, that's generally bad. The lone bright spots were Michael Irvin, a rookie wideout who was already beginning to shine, and Herschel Walker, a running back clearly ready to take over the league. The team blew multiple leads, including a 20-0 halftime advantage on their route to a league-worst 3-13 record. In the final game of the season, Dallas needed a loss to maintain the worst position in the league. A win would knock them down to the 3rd pick. They scored no points through the game's final 3 quarters and comfortably coasted their way to number 1. Shortly after that season ended, Cowboy football was flipped on its head in a way it quite literally never had been. Jerry Jones swept in and made his mark, purchasing the franchise for a cool $140 million. Yes, this is less than a decade after the Rockets sold for like $11 million. As soon as he did, he fired head coach Tom Landry, who had held the spot for 28 years since the team's inception. The move, though now agreed to be necessary, still angers some Cowboys fans for the way Jerry did it, without enough respect for the architect of the Cowboys. But it was his team now, and he signed on Jimmy Johnson from the University of Miami to run the squad. A few months later, it turned out to be a pretty nice draft to have the first pick in. The Cowboys chose Troy Aikman at that number 1 spot. If you didn't want a QB, that's alright, grab Barry Sanders. More into defense? Derek Thomas at 4. Need something flashy? You got Deion Sanders at 5. You can't say the Cowboys made the wrong choice, but that would have been hard to do so at all. The only misfire would have been if they went for Tony Mandarich, the big man who may have had the most disrespectful 1-2 combo of Sports Illustrated covers to ever exist. Curiously, the Cowboys also went out of their way to make a pick in the compensatory draft this same offseason. And they chose to select a second quarterback, Steve Walsh, to pair alongside Aikman, drafting 2 QBs in the same offseason. If you're a Browns fan, that's generally bad. The decision to take this second quarterback cost the Cowboys their first-round pick the very next season, making it even more of an interesting choice. The obvious explanation is that new head coach Jimmy Johnson wanted his Miami quarterback and really liked coaching him there. Troy Aikman just turned out to be too good for Jimmy to get his way. The team limped into the next season without nearly enough improvement, but the inner workings of a dynasty starting to come together. This wouldn't be an easy season, and the absence of their own first-round pick is proof that they really weren't trying to lose. They were just that bad. Week 1 was a warning. Week 2, pain. By week 3, reality. Then, in order, sorrow, dejection, trade Herschel Walker, misery, woe, dread, and finally, frolic. Wins weren't being had, but if you squinted just right, and a few other teams made some really dumb trades, there was something coming together in Dallas. Yeah, we should touch on the Herschel Walker flip. In one of the biggest trades in NFL history, a young, premier running back was sent to Minnesota for a whole package of guys. And this right here doesn't even show the draft picks. It gets better, too. Jimmy Johnson, the Cowboys' new coach, would make one single move that would cause all Vikings fans to absolutely detest him for eternity. Often attached to trades were conditional draft picks. It was a sort of insurance for both teams that if a trade turned out to be horribly lopsided, the loser would at least get a few more picks. The way this worked was a combination of total playing time and how long the players in the trade stayed on their new roster. Finding a bit of a loophole mixed with a bit of incompetence from Minnesota, Jimmy Johnson simply benched, traded, or cut all the players he received in the trade. The Cowboys were in no position to win now and sort of just liquidated everything into conditional draft picks. That took their draft haul from this to this. 3 first-rounders over the next 3 years, and then some. The Cowboys would then multiply these picks beyond belief. I won't even try getting into what they all became, but here's a full chart if you're interested. Jimmy Johnson claimed the team made 51 different trades in the next season, much of them made possible because of the Herschel Walker deal. It's worth noting that right when they made the Herschel trade, it was seen almost unanimously as a horrible move for Dallas that aged into maybe the biggest robbery ever. This, and a couple more good deals on much smaller scales, would go on to become absolutely instrumental for the Cowboys building their dynasty. They got a win sandwich around a lot more losses, but not without one of my favorite individual performances in NFL history. This is James Dixon. If you haven't heard of him, that's alright, and if you have, that's a little alarming. The guy played 3 years in the league for Dallas, caught less than 30 career balls, but week 10 against the Cardinals, the rookie had his one hit, and we're still wondering how it happened. Up to this point, he had a total of 117 yards on the season. That's through 9 weeks, so a little over 10 a game. But today, for whatever reason, he hauled in 203 yards worth of stuff in a game that, well, the Cowboys still lost, it's the '89 Cowboys, but Dixon would have more yards in this single game than before or after through his entire career. Shout out, James, add him to the wall. And 2 weeks later, came malice. The Cowboys had 2 games against the Philadelphia Eagles scheduled within 3 weeks. It takes a lot for a team that's this bad to have a regular season football game still being remembered 35 years later. Like, that's not something that happens. Welcome to the Bounty Bowls.
Goes right for Lewis and DeHaas. It's legal. Once the kick is in the air, the kicker becomes a football player in the NFL. Now, we want to show you another angle here because then DeHaas gets flagged because he drops down and it's in below the knees. And then after the game...
We start on Thanksgiving. The football was never a contest. The closest this game got was 0-0. Eagles flew high today, but something dirty was going on the field. 2 teams, already rivals, who have been chippy and running the score up on each other in past years. Allegedly, this game had actual $100 cash bounties placed on the heads of the Cowboys kicker and quarterback Troy Aikman. These were, again, allegedly placed by Eagles head coach Buddy Ryan, and the accuser was Jimmy Johnson, directly in his post-game interview. I honestly shouldn't even butcher his words, I'll quote him. I have absolutely no respect for the way they played the game. I would have said something to Buddy, but he wouldn't stand on the field long enough. He put his big fat rear end into the dressing room. Buddy, your response?
And so I have no respect for the man at all.
The accusations were always denied by the Eagles and Buddy himself, though it was revealed that Buddy Ryan was known to award players $100 every week for what he called the game's best play, but was in reality usually just the biggest hit. This intensity on Thanksgiving set the stage for a beautifully timed rematch a mere 17 days later. This one, taking place in Philadelphia, had the NFL commissioner in attendance. Eagles fans, stop me if you've heard this before, bombarded Cowboy players on the field with snowballs, ice, and beer. Coaches, refs, and announcers were targeted. One broadcaster compared the game to his recent dental surgery, which was slightly more pleasant to attend. An Eagles defensive lineman did eventually do the right thing. He stood up on his own sideline and told the eager fans to calm down with the throwing stuff. He was immediately pelted with a barrage of snowballs and returned to his target range of a sideline. One fan years later admitted that he bet his buddy $20 that he couldn't reach the field with a snowball from their nosebleed seats. That fan would go on to become the governor and then mayor of Philadelphia. The Cowboys would lose the game and wouldn't stop losing games. 1-15 was the final record on the season, with a would-be first overall pick forfeited because of Steve Walsh. It was the team's worst NFL record ever, and the first time the boys didn't get on Monday Night Football. But with a barrage of draft picks from all over the league and a team of talent slowly developing, everything was going according to plan for Jerry Jones. The Cowboys took some steps up over the next 2 seasons, getting into the playoffs and winning a round. Then they won back-to-back Super Bowls. Why I feel these Cowboys are the perfect ones to talk about here are the subtle nuances between rebuilding and tanking. Though used interchangeably, these are not necessarily the same term in sports. Tanking is more its own form of a rebuild. And whether you call it a tank or a rebuild, looking in hindsight for the Cowboys, it was seemingly the most efficient and successful way to get the franchise back up. No one can really argue with the results. I wouldn't say Jerry actively wanted to lose games that first year, but he knew what he was doing was a multi-year experience. And just like anyone in the NFL at the time, he was well aware that Troy Aikman was gonna be up for grabs for whoever happened to have the worst record in the league. The thought, the mere idea, had to be in his mind. And Jerry did take part in a lot of different aspects of tanking, the roster blow up and piling up young guys with draft picks. He's guilty of all that. Of course, the first overall pick is often the most associated with tanking, and they weren't eligible for that in the second season. And that's why outright tanking, and a large reason why it's so hard to eradicate, is almost impossible to definitively prove. The differences from basketball to football in rebuilds, as we touched on, is apparent. The 2 main examples I gave weren't the best thing to show that because of the insane Cowboys turnaround. They're sort of an outlier. A better way to visualize the difference as a whole is by looking at the success of number 1 draft picks by sport. Here's every first overall pick in the NFL and NBA over a 40-year period. I've color-coded them as to show choices who were All-Stars or Hall of Famers, and adding up the totals reveals that the NFL is not far behind in terms of All-Stars, though the gap does grow when you narrow it down to just Halls. This falls directly in line with the notion that basketball is the easier sport to draft in and is generally better at identifying talent. When you add baseball in, and its history of first overall talent, the story continues to tell itself in a clear way. The major leagues are incredibly inaccurate with who they think is the very best prospect in the country year after year. Baseball is by far the hardest sport to scout and predict future stars. This is why 10 people play on the baseball field at once, yet the MLB draft has 30 rounds, compared to football where 22 people play at once, yet the NFL only needs 7 rounds. The minor leagues play a large part in this too. You basically have to fill out 4 separate teams at different levels, even though less than 2% of all players in the minors will ever reach Major League Baseball. It's by far the most needle in a haystack sport. When you're drafted first overall in baseball, you are still more likely to not make an all-star team than make one. This is the best visual aid, in my opinion, as to why tanking is the most popular in basketball. It's not just that one player can change a team the most, it's also the fact that the NBA is the best at knowing who that one player is gonna be. You can even step out of the first pick. Only 19 MLB Hall of Famers have ever been drafted in the first round. The NBA, on the other hand, has had this many since 1965. This is also why tanking tends to lead towards a much longer process in professional baseball, due to the low odds of hitting on a pick, mixed with the need to have a very complete all-around roster to win. It's generally these multi-year, 3 or 4 season blow-ups that you see to get multiple picks with the same idea of how to rebuild your team, but everything taking place on a longer timescale. Now, I want to answer one more overarching question through the rest of this video, and that is, regardless of whether or not tanking works, teams are still doing it. So how do we solve it? To figure that out, let's learn about a couple more recent teams who underwent the tank as we step towards the more modern mainstream examples. Now, I've only watched a small percentage the last decade or so of any of these leagues in my life, so please give me your own stories about this. But for me personally, the first time I really remember hearing the concept of tanking was around the 2011 NFL season surrounding quarterback Andrew Luck. Let's take it to 2010. The iPad is released. Y2K turns 10, 1999 turns 11, and Peyton Manning is still on the Colts. This was a roster that was top-heavy, with 3 more Pro Bowlers around the sheriff, but bottom ugly. Despite that, they went 10-6 and nearly won a wildcard game. If WAR was a football stat, Peyton Manning deserves like 8 wins above replacement. He could make Blue Mountain State a playoff team. But after the season, bad news was looming. An injury that Peyton had actually been dealing with for years, stemming from this hit way back in 2006, had nagged away enough to the point of requiring full-blown neck surgery. Over the offseason, the media projections were almost solely focused on when, if at all, Peyton would make his return. It never came. Without him, the team struggled mightily. If 2010 was a year, 2011 was the year that came after it. The offense died like a horse. Horses do die, so it fits. They dropped in every measurable statistic, 30th in the league in total yards compared to 4th the prior season. But a new conversation began to float around through the season, and even before it started a little. Whether or not the Colts would match the 2008 Detroit Lions as the second NFL team to ever go 0-16. The Manning effect, or lack thereof, was stunning. And at that same time, another quarterback started grabbing headlines in Indianapolis. In the coming NFL draft class was a Stanford Cardinal quarterback considered nearly unanimously to be a surefire stud in the NFL. Andrew Luck probably would have been the first overall pick if he came out last year, but the now redshirt junior decided to soak up his college years and post an even more impressive season this year. By the time of the draft, he was arguably the most obvious number 1 pick in NFL history. The sweepstakes for just who would get to select the star became widely known, chanted by fans, and written on signs into this NFL season. Suck for luck.
If you suck for luck, you gotta suck for luck and never stop.
This was an era, the earliest of tanking in the real limelight of the world, and jumped on by the media. They started debating losing on purpose on SportsCenter and various ESPN shows. News outlets reported on the race to the bottom, most famously a CNN article that we can revisit today to gain a much better perspective on the time. When this was written, we were 6 weeks into the season. There existed a great debate, namely among the 3 winless teams in the league, for who was going to get luck. Anchoring the NFL was the 0-5 Rams, 0-5 Dolphins, and 0-6 Colts. The favorite seemed to be Miami in almost every form. Recently having purchased the team was fresh owner Stephen Ross. Even ignoring his future associations with tanking, he was already said to have told close friends of his that he was fully okay with losing if it meant he got a franchise quarterback. Translation, go ahead and suck, if it's for luck. This did not make people happy. Now, This article can also serve as a perfect time capsule for where the media stood on tanking at the time and the use of the term itself. There's over 1,000 words in this write-up, but the word tanking comes up just one single time. The context of it is this. A Twitter account is imploring the Miami Dolphins, or the terrible NFL team of your choice, to tank for the number 1 overall draft pick. To me, this shows that the word still hadn't evolved to the point where it is now. It wasn't as popular to use for teams throwing away their seasons quite yet. Now the 2011 season stomped along. The Miami Dolphins played themselves out of the race for last. Despite a gloriously awful 0-7 start, they would then finish the rest of the season at 6-3, nowhere near the top pick discussion. Their error was pretty clear. Come back with me to week 1 of this very season. The Dolphins are not hopeless. They have an offense with Reggie Bush, Brandon Marshall, and Big Jake Long at tackle, and the presumed weak spot of quarterback decided to shut everyone up about him. Chad Henne, one of the greatest Michigan QBs of all time and a future forgotten piece of the Chiefs dynasty, got on the field and went to work today. His opponent, likely trembling, terrified by Chad's mere presence, was a man named Tom. If the world was normal, this would be slaughtered. But anything is possible. The Dolphins lost the game, but that did not shield the world from an absolute duel between leaders today. 1,000 yards of total offense. Brady throws for 517 and 4 touchdowns. Henne does his darn best to keep up with 416 and 2 touchdowns. Within a couple weeks, he had gotten off whatever magic stuff he was on that game. By week 4, winless, he suffered a season-ending injury. This is where the Dolphins' key mistake was made. They tried to continue the tank, but in doing so, they put a man at quarterback whose powers were grossly underestimated. It took a sec. Then Matt Moore beat the Chiefs with 3 touchdowns and no picks. He won the AFC Player of the Week and got the squad its first win. Then they won 2 more in a row with another Player of the Week from Matty Moe. Ultimately, he'd play so good that he destroyed the Dolphins' chances at a tank, but he still played his way out of the job. Even though they fell all the way to the 8th pick in the draft without even a sniff of Andrew Luck, the Dolphins took quarterback number 3 of the class in Ryan Tannehill. That offseason, he would beat Matt for the starting job, relegating the old moisturizer to the backup role. 1 down, 2 to go. The Colts and Rams took their tanking a lot more serious. Indianapolis started out 0-14. The winless season whispers were screams at this point, as was discussion on the almost impressive level of dedication they were showing to the tank. This was a bad football team. At that same spot in the season, the Rams were beginning to lose hope. Their 2 wins seemed like too much to make up on the awful Colts. Then Indy did the unthinkable. This was a game that made 0 sense for either team. The Colts needed a loss for the draft, the Titans needed a win for the playoffs. This would have been the perfect opportunity for collusion. It did not go that way. On this day, the hatred of division rivals shined brighter than the tank. Then the Colts did it again. In Week 16, they won their 2nd game in a row and 2nd of the season to move into a tie with the Rams. They did luckily own the tiebreaker, meaning they still controlled their own fate, and a loss next week would mean picking first. Luckily, with their hooves on the ropes, they would lose, and shortly after the season ended, with the first pick secured, they released Peyton Manning and even announced before the draft that they were taking Luck. It wasn't just obvious, it was decided. They grabbed him, and the rest is history. Andrew Luck just, unfortunately, can't remember that history. The reason to release Manning rather than trade him has confused some people who look back on it, but it really did make sense at the time. It was mainly because of a large signing bonus that they would have to pay if he was traded, and on top of that, there was at least some push from Colts fans to let Peyton have the choice of where he went rather than trading him, out of respect for what he'd done to the franchise. These last 2 games seem like going against the tank, but really, Indy never lost control of their own destiny. It was all up to them losing. They needed no luck to get Andrew. A few years later, the NFL world once again flocked to a prospect many deemed worth losing for. Rather than rhyming, in 2019, an awesome alliterative attempt at acquiring an amazing asset actually arose again. Tank for Tua. Tua Tagovailoa entered the 2019 NFL season as the odds-on favorite to be the number 1 pick. The Alabama quarterback had just thrown a storybook touchdown pass to win a national championship last year, and he looked stellar at Alabama to start the year. A couple teams, but mainly once again the Miami Dolphins, were said to be tanking for a guy they thought could be a franchise quarterback. And if you want to see a tanking team, look no further. The 2019 Miami Dolphins went overboard to the maximum, no shame whatsoever. It was public knowledge exactly what they were doing. I'll do my best to explain how interestingly awful this football team was, but there was nothing like watching it. It's one of the most mind-boggling, statistically impossible seasons to ever grace sports. After last year, the Dolphins went shopping in the enemy bin, hiring Brian Flores from the New England Patriots staff. With the overhaul of the front office, a rebuild was pretty obvious. Discussion of Miami tanking was coming up early in the offseason. Before Flores even coached a game, he was denying accusations. But the team's actions would cause many to disagree with his words. The roster was blown to pieces. In March of 2019, early offseason, Miami traded their franchise quarterback, Ryan Tannehill, who was the participation trophy from the Suck for Luck sweepstakes. They ship him and a pick to the Titans, get 2 picks back. 3 days later, they'd replace the traded quarterback with ultra journeyman Ryan Fitzpatrick. The big kahuna came in August. Laramie Tunsil, Kenny Stills, and some picks to the Texans in exchange for 2 firsts and a second, and a couple other players. Then, mid-September, the season had already started. One more big move sends Minka Fitzpatrick to the Steelers, swap some late picks, get a first-rounder from it. After the liquidation, which was all done by week 3, Miami's roster was obliterated. 5th-year wideout Devontae Parker was the team's longest tenured player. He was drafted in 2015. They lost games, yeah, sure, 0-4 to start things out, then graced with a bye week, but plenty of teams lose games. This specific year, a lot of teams were losing games, fielding the whole tank for Tua into a whole spectacle. Through 5 weeks, there were 4 different NFL teams without a win. And beautifully, 2 of those 4 teams were guaranteed a W this week, because the Dolphins and Redskins were taking each other on, and the Jets got to play the Cowboys. Now, the NFL has a long, illustrious history. This Dolphins-Redskins matchup is one of the most sensational things that's ever happened. To fully understand it, we need to talk about both teams, how impressively bad one of them was, and, of course, Jim Thorpe. Honestly, there's not much to say on the Redskins. They lost 5 games, a couple were close, the rest weren't. They had Adrian Peterson, that's fun, and a lot of people were saying they're racist. Now, the Dolphins. Week 1, Lamar Jackson had spent his last season taking over the Ravens' starting job for good. This was the first year where the team was his start to finish. The start part went pretty well. The Ravens beat the Dolphins by 49 points, the largest Week 1 deficit in NFL history. It was not that close. The Ravens scored 42 points in the first half. Lamar Jackson finished the game with a perfect passer rating, 17 for 20, 5 touchdowns, and 324 yards. Then Robert Griffin III came in, another tie back to the Suck for Luck era, and he went 6 for 6 with a touchdown. In fact, Baltimore had 3 different Heisman Trophy winners score a touchdown today. That's never happened before or after. Things did not start great for the Ryan Fitzpatrick-led Dolphins. Do you know who they put at quarterback in this game to relieve him? Josh Rosen. Things did not get better. Week 2, a disgusting 43-0 shutout. Smaller margin of victory, larger level of embarrassment. The Dolphins saw that and decided to start Josh Rosen the next week. Vegas laughed. Miami were 22-point underdogs against the Cowboys. Josh Rosen took a deep breath, closed his eyes, buckled his chin strap, and lost the game by 25 points. He was also benched midway through the game in favor of Ryan Fitzpatrick. Miami's defense, in what was by far their most impressive outing of the season so far, let in 31 points. Week 4 was more sad. They lost by 20, but look a little deeper. 38-year-old Phillip Rivers tossed over 300 yards and 2 touchdowns. This defense could not stop a car if they had a brake pedal. Miami thanked the Lord for a bye week and walked sheepishly into the Tank Bowl. Understanding how atrocious this start is not hard. Through 5 weeks, and again, they only got 4 games in there, the Miami Dolphins had a worse point differential than any team in NFL history. Pre-merger history included. Back to 1920, the closest team to them provides some context on how bad this really is. I don't want to make any of you nostalgic, but we're going to revisit your mom's dad's favorite NFL team growing up, the 1923 Oorang Indians. Yep, you're thinking of the right team, headlined by guys like Joe Littletwig, Jim Thorpe, and, of course, longtime Sleep. This team was not good. Through the first 10 weeks of the season, they scored 12 total points. And they had a better point differential through 5 weeks than the 2019 Miami Dolphins. Now, you may be wondering something. The Oorang Indians, that is quite a name. I mean, what a random place to get to say they had an NFL team. You know, where is Oorang anyway? And I couldn't blame you for asking that question, because Oorang is not a place, and it never was. It's a state of mind. The Oorang Indians were created as a football team just the prior year, and they had one reason for existing: to advertise the owner's dog kennels, where he specialized in a rare breed known as an Oorang Airedale. This guy paid $100, got an NFL team, and used it strictly for advertising his business. It's awesome stuff. The entire team was made up of Native American athletes. Thanks to a preserved article, we can actually trace the very formation to a hunting trip taken between the owner, Walter Lingo, Jim Thorpe, and a few other athletes. He was able to lure in the athletic superstar Thorpe to serve as the team's coach and player, but the aging famous sportsman served more as an attraction to put on flyers and get people in the gates. Some promotions and programs they used to advertise with have not aged very well. Now, without an actual city that they were based in, Oorang was known as a traveling NFL team, a semi-common occurrence in the early days of football where a squad would just play all their games at opponents' stadiums. In the team's whole existence, they were named the home team for just one game, and that took place at a neutral stadium in Marion, Ohio. The team's strategy actually didn't work horribly. They drew some solid numbers of attendance and kept throwing whatever charades they could to boost that number. In fact, due to almost being more of a traveling show than a competing team, one strategy Walter Lingo threw out was halftime performances. Many credit him with inventing the idea of the halftime show. One player I mentioned earlier, longtime Sleep, famously wrestled a bear at halftime of an NFL game that he played in, which should be worthy of Hall of Fame consideration on its own. These halftime shows eventually became more of a draw for Oorang's diehard fans than the actual football. Unfortunately, as the team just lost, attendance would eventually dwindle, and this season would be the last of the Oorang Indians. An important piece of NFL history. Now, the Dolphins-Redskins Tank Bowl went about how you'd expect. There were 6 punts in the first quarter. Miami, after rolling with Josh Rosen, benched him after 2 quick picks and went back to Fitzpatrick. Down 7, he would lead a touchdown drive late in the game. Rather than tie, the Dolphins went for a win and made a play call that might be the most obvious example of on-field tanking we've ever seen. Miami loses, or wins, the Tank Bowl. Tua was still the QB1 of the draft, though the gap was closing, and Miami was clearly the team who wanted him the most. What ensued over the rest of the season was a hilariously ironic turn of events. Miami kept the tank up for a bit, losing to the Bills, allowed an onside kick touchdown. They lost handedly to the Steelers with Minkah Fitzpatrick, who they traded away earlier in the season, grabbing 2 interceptions. Then they got their first win against their old head coach and the New York Jets. You could attribute this to Adam Gase, but then the Dolphins abandoned the tank completely. Riding behind a Fitzmagic run, because they put him back to starter again, they won 5 games and plummeted to the 5th overall pick in the draft, after seeming like a lock for Tua. But it gets better. Midway through the season, Tua had led Alabama to an 8-1 record, their only loss being by 5 points against what many consider to be a top college football team ever, the Joe Burrow LSU Tigers. But tragically, Tua would suffer a season-ending hip injury in the very next game, causing his draft stock to fall and questions to loom over his long-term health. And how far did Tua fall in the draft? Well, right to the randomly decent Miami Dolphins at 5th overall. He was the second quarterback off the board. The first and number 1 overall pick was Joe Burrow, rewarded to the Cincinnati Bengals, who completely deserved it after a perfectly executed full-season tank. They started 0-11, got their one win to avoid 0-16, and then locked up the first overall pick in the second-to-last week. After that, they even won a meaningless Week 17 matchup to get 2 on the year, and still won Joe Burrow. Even when we make up a catchphrase about losing for a guy, sometimes they're still not the star of the draft. Often, what turns out to be the most important is not your draft pick, but your draft picker. Identifying talent is the skill. As we approach the present day, that more long-term form of tanking that baseball has really begins to spread into the limelight. There's 2 examples that seemed to convince the rest of the major leagues that tanking is the best option to go from bottom to top, and they both happened somewhat simultaneously. The Chicago Cubs had a 108-year period of sorrow and sadness. Years 103 to 105 were particularly some of the worst, posting a 100-loss season for just the 3rd time in franchise history. The Houston Astros had a 4-year period of absolute suckitude to the stars. They lost over 100 games in 3 straight years. But thanks to Theo Epstein and some metal trash cans respectively, both teams made those years worth every second of suffering. The Cubs laid the blueprint out. Draft high, spend nothing, build up the minors, and care not about wins. The 4 horsemen of tanking, really. A couple years of that can leave you with a playoff team and big pockets to add to it. The Cubbies went from one of baseball's biggest spenders to a middle-of-the-pack team at best when signing free agents. Through the draft, the team built Javi Baez in 2011, Chris Bryant in 2013, Kyle Schwarber in 2014. Then, after a couple of developing years, building up this core, they went all in on the win now. Signed proven guys like John Lester, Jason Hayward, Ben Zobrist. And this formula worked. It netted a championship, and at the time, the Cubs seemed destined to win at least one more with this group. Unfortunately, due to some poorly timed cold bats and a few other outside factors, not much else would materialize for this core. But for this specific fan base, just one ring was probably more than worth any 3 to 5 year tanking period they could have possibly endured. What the Cubs front office was doing at the time, even if they didn't realize it, was going to inspire a decade plus of attempted copycats in the MLB trying to blow up their roster and put something together from the ground up. Now, you couldn't quite call the Astros a copycat because their rebuild kinda started around the same time as the Cubs. They actually overlapped in terms of awfulness. In 2012, when the Cubs were the 2nd worst team in the league, they were only bested, or worsted, by the Astros. But in this aspect of tanking, and all the other main ones that the Cubs laid out and followed perfectly, the Astros simply did the same thing, but each to a way higher degree. The intensity was turned up to 11. This here represents 6 seasons in Major League Baseball, almost the exact same 6 we just looked at, but now from the Astros' point of view. Let's start with record. Since 1961, a total of 94 different baseball teams have finished a season with over 100 losses. That means in the last 60 years, over 3% of every team to lose 100 games was the Houston Astros from 2011 to 2013. One squad was even able to reach the unsung distinction of 110 losses, a rare achievement that instantly puts you into the discussion of the worst teams ever. That was 2013. This was a funny season. The Astros actually played a game this year that had a Nielsen rating of 0. That is awesome, and it's even better than it sounds. This isn't like an audience rating thing and everyone gave 0 stars, it's much more impressive. Nielsen ratings is a way to get accurate feedback on television viewing habits of people. Houses are selected at random to be a Nielsen family and have their data tracked. In 2013, the city of Houston had 581 different assigned households that affected Nielsen ratings. In the Astros' 9-2 loss on September 22, 2013, Not a single one of those 581 households even tuned in for a second of the baseball game. It's worth noting that this was a Sunday, and the Astros were thus competing for viewership against the NFL's Houston Texans, a battle they lost handedly. But I also don't want to make excuses for them either. They weren't losing their entire fan base to football. About a week before this, the Astros had set a previous record low viewership in the Houston area with an estimated 1,000 viewers. That very same day, in the Houston market, 1,500 viewers tuned in to catch a WNBA game between the Sky and the Lynx. The Sky and the Lynx play in Chicago and Minnesota, respectively. More people in Houston watched an out-of-market WNBA game featuring no one within 1,000 miles of their city rather than watching the Houston Astros play baseball. Now, another important factor of the Astro rebuild was their farm system. Here are the rankings across these 6 years of all their minor league teams. Sure, they sucked, but anyone who knew baseball knew the Astros had a future ahead of them. And they kept building that future bigger and bigger. Jose Altuve was signed as an undrafted free agent years ago in 2006, but wouldn't play in the majors till 2011. And come 2011, 11th overall, they grab George Springer. Then the real sucking starts. Houston drafts 1st overall in 2012, picks up Carlos Correa. They suck again. 2013, 2 first overall picks in a row. This one was a miss. They took a shot on the pitcher Mark Appel, who would never play an MLB game for Houston. The very next pick, Chris Bryant to the Cubs. But don't worry, you're the Astros. I'm sure you'll be picking early again. 2014, yeah, 3 years in a row of 1st overall picks. And the best part is, this one was an even bigger miss. Brady Aiken, another pitcher, became one of just 3 people to ever be drafted 1st overall and not play a single MLB game. In fact, Houston never even signed Aiken to their roster. The next season, they won a couple more games, fell to the 5th overall pick in the draft, but as compensation for not signing their 1st overall pick last year, the Astros were awarded the 2nd overall pick this year. With that one, they grabbed Alex Bregman, and at 5, they drafted Kyle Tucker, who took a little longer but ended up blooming into a star. So there is a quick version of the Houston Astros rebuild, maybe the most obvious tank job in sports history. Fans didn't like it. Attendance for the Astros dipped to pitiful levels. The team spent no money. In fact, that 2013 team, despite horrid attendance, ratings, and performance, was the most profitable baseball team in MLB history. When you don't spend anything, whatever you do make is instantly profit. Of course, these down years aren't why we're talking about the Astros. It's these years. Now, if you really think the Astros were cheating and banging trash cans and didn't deserve these rings, I'll direct you to my Asterisks in Sports video because I talk a lot more about it there. I'm going to avoid the whole cheating aspect here. The Houston Astros are not just a clear form of tanking. With how obvious they were, it only made their eventual success louder. They now serve as a pro-tanker's favorite example of why the strategy works. And the Astros coming right after the Cubs with basically an overextended version of the Cubs rebuild, they got into the heads of MLB executives across the country. Teams like the Orioles, Tigers, Marlins, and Royals have each undergone their own version of a tank job since 2 success stories burst out on the scene. But the question that no one seems to be able to answer is, does tanking work? Does it work in baseball? Does it work in basketball, but not football? Should I tank? And should I be happy with my team for tanking? Because right now it sucks to watch, I'll tell you that. Well, the all-knowing, omniscient answer of it all, in my opinion, is no. Tanking is not a strategy that provides any more chance at bringing home a championship than simply constructing a roster of talent and good fits while always trying to improve. I wish that teams had to fill out a form and make it public knowledge when they were tanking a season so we could have this nice pretty graph of every team that's ever tanked and how it ended up for them. You look at those results, maybe compare them to the non-tanking teams, and you have your answer. It would be painless. Unfortunately, that's just not how it works. It's a much more enigmatic, elusive thing that varies in intensity, length, and commitment on a case-by-case basis. It's tough to pin down or get one good-for-all explanation for what is tanking and what isn't. And as we've touched on, this all ties into why it's so hard to prove and punish a team for tanking. But I'm still gonna do my best to show why it doesn't work. Let's hop back to that graph of first overall picks, separated by each league. Now, we originally went over this as to judge the effectiveness of drafting league by league, and the NBA's consistent production of stars and superstars fell in line with what we know. But we can take this one step further to have it illustrate a completely different point in a great way. To make this easier to visualize, I'm going to split our one graph into 3 individual ones for each sport. Then I took all those first overall draft picks across sports, recorded the team that selected them first, and measured that team's championship success over the following 2 decades. On top are the number 1 draft picks whose team won a championship with them within just 5 years of picking them first. The middle row is teams who won a championship within 20 years of making that draft pick, and the bottom row didn't get one within 2 decades. Extremely important to note here are a couple things. First, I'm only going up to 2005 in order to not use players or teams whose stats could change. Also, these are not the worst teams in the league year by year. It's the teams that drafted first, meaning they could have acquired that pick through trade or, in the NBA's case, getting lucky in the lottery. Still, judging the long-term effects of picking first on a franchise can give us an idea on what you're going into when you tank. With your best case scenario, first overall pick, and judging if it's really worth it. Now, this graph is over a 40-year period, and in that time, in all 3 of our major sports, even basketball, less than half of the franchises to pick number 1 overall won a single championship within 20 years of that selection. More often than not, drafting first overall in any of these leagues means you're not likely winning any rings anytime soon. And really, I'm not sure I've done a good enough job at getting across how undependable of a strategy tanking is. I've been focusing on mostly success stories, the teams that are the reason everyone wants to tank. What's vital to understand is that for every Cubs or Astros or Cowboys or Rockets, there is like 100 trust the processes. Again, one of the more famous tank jobs, Philadelphia basketball literally adopted the identity of don't worry about us losing 60 games a season, it'll all be worth it when we start winning. The man behind the curtains of the tankathon was general manager Sam Hinkie. He had a plan to better his team, and he did not hide that it was going to look ugly to start. And ugly it looked. A few spectacularly substandard Sixers seasons, spotlighted by a 72-loss Super Tank showdown in 2016, alliteration, did not make the NBA community happy. It was seemingly a lack of managerial efforts, which, if that was a crime, plenty of teams' honchos would be locked up. But through it all, the team slowly assembled a collection of future star talent, and the city of Philadelphia, power to them, had supported the efforts of this plan through the bad, the ugly, and the worse. And finally, they were beginning to see the future too. Philly grabbed Joel Embiid with the 3rd pick, Jahlil Okafor at 3 the very next season. 2016, they luck into the 1st pick in the lottery, get Ben Simmons, who a lot of people saw as a sort of mini LeBron, They weren't done either. The first pick in the very next season's draft, back-to-back, nets them Markelle Fultz, solidifying a young core in Philadelphia with pre-draft potential to the likes we've never seen before. But Sam Hinkie, the architect, was not able to last through his own plan. He willingly stepped down in 2016 after the 10-win season. And willingly stepped down as being kind. He was asked to take on a lesser role by management and was starting to be forced out. Still, when Hinkie resigned, there were some in the basketball world who predicted a sort of Mark Jackson Warriors situation where Sam Hinkie put in place a core that could be a dynasty. He just wasn't going to be there long enough to see the fruits of his labor. Those people, power to them, turned out wrong. Markelle Fultz was a bust, and the Sixers probably played a part in him not reaching his full potential. Jahlil Okafor, another bust. Ben Simmons missed his whole first year with injury and became a decent number 2 alongside Joel Embiid, but he was never able to get Philly winning deep in the playoffs, and he's seen his career dwindle down quickly. And it is Joel Embiid, who was a great draft pick with like 6 asterisks on that statement. He's sort of the center of this tanking rebuild. I mean, the guy literally took the process part of trust the process and made it his nickname. And he asked to be called this. This is a self-nicknamed guy here, in case you forgot. Unfortunately, due to non-stop health issues, the process for Philadelphia has become one that never resulted in a single conference finals appearance so far. I bring Philly up to at least have a solid example of the dark side of tanking, losing a lot of games by design and never winning nearly enough to make up for it. The team went anti-competitive for 3 years and has nothing to show for it now. So here's the weird thing. I don't think tanking works. I think the data backs up that tanking doesn't work. While some aspects of it are essential to a rebuild, you don't want to intentionally build this losing culture because it's hard to get rid of. Some definitely disagree with me, and the actions still being taken right now by various front offices across sports prove that a lot of people much smarter than me disagree with what I'm saying. So I look at it like this. Regardless of whose side is correct, if tanking is good or bad, throw the question out. Teams are still tanking, so how do we stop it? We'll play a hypothetical game. We have all the power we want across all sports. How do we fix it? I would really love to hear some of your ideas here. For some help, let's just refresh on exactly what measures every sport currently has in place. In the NFL, there is nothing. Owners have been outed for tanking in lawsuits, but the draft still takes place in an inverse order based purely on win-loss record. It's kind of random, but I feel like I have to mention at some point in this video that the way early unstable NFL used to have a very weird and interesting system for determining the first pick. Through the late 40s and into the 50s, before the first Super Bowl was even played, pro football experimented with what they called a bonus pick system. The first overall pick in every draft had absolutely nothing to do with record. In 1947, every team had their logo put into a hat and one was drawn out. That team, the Chicago Bears, got the first pick. The next season, every team except the Bears went back into the hat and another team was drawn. This continued for 12 years until every team had been awarded the pick. In the final year, the Cardinals automatically got it because they were the last team remaining. Upon completion of its first full league cycle, the bonus pick system was abandoned, and most agree with that decision, but it's an interesting different perspective. Back to the program. The NBA has its lottery system, and its most recent adjustment, made in direct response to the Philadelphia 76ers trust the process, they gave equal odds to each of the 3 worst teams in the league, with descending weighted odds for every team after. This current NBA season itself has been proof that this system is still being abused. It arguably got worse, because now you just have even more teams tanking to make sure they're in the bottom 3 for the best chances at the NBA's next generational prospect. And baseball, which had no special system in place for its entire long existence, just recently implemented a draft lottery of its own for the first time in 2022. The Cubs and Astros made tanking such a problem that they had to institute this to combat it. Similar to the current NBA version, it gives the bottom 3 teams equal odds with descending after that. There's also some interesting stuff in there with how tiebreakers are decided being based on how much money the team generates, and larger market teams not being able to win the lottery 2 years in a row. Now, we can't really discredit the MLB lottery too much just because it hasn't been around long enough to see the effects of, but as we touched on, I consider the NBA draft lottery to be an absolute failure, and I don't think much more proof is needed than the fact tanking rose to the limelight. I don't have high hopes for the MLBs, but it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. So, just for fun, me and my High Council Brain Trust, consisting of such coveted sports minds as my roommates, my father, and my brother, have come up with the following solutions to tanking. The first idea brought up, and the one most often thrown around, is to simply unweigh the lottery. Every non-playoff team gets an equal shot at being first. You can debate the pros and cons of this, but it's funny that this is such a common argument when the NBA has already tried this, and ended up pulling it after 5 years because it didn't work. Truly bad teams aren't rewarded enough, and bubble teams just tank out of the playoffs to get the same odds at the first pick, rather than a first-round exit. Someone threw around the idea of basing the lottery not on teams' records, but on their records against other lottery teams. This could have the potential of making usually boring matchups more interesting, but it also makes the other half of the games that much more important to tank, and it isn't necessarily rewarding the teams who need it most. We joked about bringing back the NFL's old system, which, just thinking about that 32-year cycle as you hope to live to see your team get the first pick is pretty comical. There was a lot of talk about restrictions, similar to what the MLB is doing, where maybe you can't get in the top 5 consecutive years. But what I thought were really our best solutions was when, instead of thinking outside the box, we just threw the box away because the box sucked at its job and it was an insult to good boxes. Let's get rid of the draft lottery. We have no stake or fear to admit we were wrong. Scrap the thing that doesn't work. What now? Maybe you do a reverse order, but instead of just based on the last season's win-loss record, you average out the last 3 or 5 seasons. It makes it much harder to go all in for the once-in-a-generation star, but it also might just elongate the process, and when looking at a sport like baseball, we're talking half a decade of tanking before a team even gets the picks it's looking for. What if instead of based on last season's record, you based it on next season's record? Well, we can't do that because we can't tell the future. How about the league puts together a panel, and they vote on who gets the first pick? The subjective leave it up to a committee strategy has worked in college football and had absolutely no controversy whatsoever. Yeah, people might not like that. How about this? The general manager of every team in the league comes together after the season. They vote between all non-playoff teams and determine the lottery order there. It discourages losing on purpose, and if you do just keep losing, teams can come together and decide to not reward you for that. An actual analysis and discussion looking at the worst teams in the league and deciding which needs the first pick the most, not just giving them the best odds because they lost a lot. It encourages young teams to still play to win, go all out, and try to make these crazy runs into the playoffs. Certain rivalries between teams and biases will exist and could be a problem, but for much of the league they should kinda cancel each other out. The biggest negative that I can see with this system is it gives small market teams the ability to sort of team up on the larger markets, because the Charlotte Hornets are never going to want to give the first pick to the Los Angeles Lakers. I don't think we see many more New York, LA, Boston first overall picks if we go this route. But if a solution's biggest negative is that it slightly hinders large market teams and gives a possible advantage to small markets, is that such a bad thing? The draft is to maintain parity. It serves as an excellent way to distribute young incoming talent throughout the country to teams with smaller fan bases. If anything, the draft is to help make up for the advantage large market teams naturally possess over the rest of the league. Los Angeles and New York and Miami have no problem attracting stars willing to sign there. What NBA player wants to live in Utah? So I think this is my favorite alternative option to the draft lottery and as a sports-wide solution to tanking. If the biggest knock on it is helping the little guys and hurting the big ones, does that make me Robin Hood? Yeah, I guess it kinda does. Make sure you share this with the professional sports league executive in your life, and maybe we'll get it going. I hope you learned a thing or two about tanking or maybe something else, and thank you.